3 minutes. 3 minutes. That would expose the difference between political mastery and amateur hour, between someone who had conquered the most competitive political arena in the world and someone who had never faced a real electoral challenge. When Bill Clinton, the man who had redefined American politics, who had survived impeachment and emerged stronger, who remained the most gifted natural politician of his generation, looked at Zohran Mamdani and delivered the devastating line, "I actually won elections." It wasn't just a reminder of past victories. It was a masterclass in political reality delivered by someone who understood that governing meant winning, not just complaining. In that moment, every serious Democrat remembered why Clinton had been the only Democrat to win 2 presidential terms since FDR, and why Mamdani's brand of politics would never advance beyond safe districts and Twitter activism. The confrontation had been building since Mamdani began criticizing the failed neoliberal policies of the Clinton era. Behind closed doors, Democratic veterans who had served in Clinton's administration watched with growing irritation as a mayor from New York lectured the party about electoral strategy. They understood something that progressive activists didn't. Bill Clinton had figured out how to win elections that Democrats had been losing for decades, and his formula remained the blueprint for democratic success in competitive America. Clinton himself had been following Mamdani's rise with the detached amusement of someone who had seen countless politicians flame out by confusing ideological purity with political effectiveness. His political instincts, honed by decades of campaigns in Arkansas and 2 successful presidential runs, recognized exactly what was wrong with contemporary progressive politics. It prioritized feeling righteous over being effective. The setting for their encounter was perfect for highlighting the generational and philosophical divide within the Democratic Party. The annual Clinton Foundation Global Initiative Conference in Little Rock. Mamdani had been invited to speak about economic justice in the 21st century, while Clinton was there to discuss his foundation's work on global poverty reduction. What was supposed to be a routine policy panel became instead a clinic in the difference between someone who talks about helping people and someone who actually does it. The Arkansas Conference Center was packed with the kind of people who understood how change actually happened. Business leaders, foundation executives, policy experts, and politicians who had successfully navigated the complex process of turning ideas into reality. These weren't Twitter activists or college protesters. These were serious people who measured success by results, not rhetoric. Mamdani spoke first, delivering his familiar critique of American capitalism and the neoliberal consensus that he blamed for inequality and climate change. He attacked the Clinton administration's embrace of free trade, financial deregulation, and welfare reform, arguing that these policies had enriched corporations while impoverishing working Americans. His speech was polished and ideologically consistent, exactly the kind of presentation that played well with progressive audiences who wanted their politics served with moral clarity rather than practical complexity. But something was wrong with the audience response. The applause was polite but restrained, lacking the enthusiasm that Mamdani had come to expect from Democratic gatherings. These were people who had actually worked on policy implementation, who understood the difference between campaign promises and governing realities. They had lived through the compromises and trade-offs that Mamdani dismissed as betrayals of progressive principles. Clinton watched from the front row, his expression impossible to read. At 77 years old, he retained the political antenna that had made him legendary, the ability to sense exactly what an audience was thinking and feeling. He could tell that Mamdani's message wasn't landing with people who had spent their careers turning idealistic goals into practical achievements. When the panel moderator introduced Clinton for his response, the former president rose with the fluid grace of someone who had commanded rooms like this for half a century. Even before he spoke, the audience's energy shifted. This was political royalty, someone who had not just talked about change, but had actually delivered it. "Thank you, Mayor Mamdani, for that passionate presentation," Clinton began, his voice carrying the Arkansas warmth that had charmed voters across America. But there was something else in his tone, a sharpness that suggested he wasn't planning to offer the usual diplomatic praise for idealistic young politicians. "I listened carefully to your critique of what you call neoliberalism, and I have to say, it reminded me of something important about the difference between politics and governing," Clinton continued, his voice taking on the cadence that had made him famous. "Politics is about promising people what they want to hear. Governing is about delivering what they actually need." The distinction was immediate, and cutting. Without directly attacking Mamdani, Clinton had already begun to undermine his credibility by suggesting his approach was more about political theater than practical results. "Now, you criticized my administration's economic policies," Clinton said, his tone remaining conversational even as he prepared to systematically dismantle Mamdani's entire worldview. "That's your right, of course. But let me share some facts with you about what those policies actually accomplished." What followed was a masterclass in political communication, as Clinton deployed his encyclopedic knowledge of policy details to devastating effect. When I took office in 1993, unemployment was over 7%. When I left office, it was under 4%, the lowest in 30 years. We created 22.7 million new jobs, lifted 7.7 million people out of poverty, and generated the largest budget surplus in American history. Each statistic was delivered with the authority of someone who had actually been responsible for governing, not just theorizing about it. But Clinton was just getting started. "You talk about inequality, Mayor, and that's a real concern," Clinton continued. "But during my presidency, incomes grew for Americans at every income level, with the largest gains going to the bottom quintile. Child poverty fell by more than a third. Home ownership reached record levels." The contrast was brutal. While Mamdani offered theoretical critiques of capitalism, Clinton was citing concrete evidence of policies that had actually improved people's lives. But it was Clinton's next move that would destroy Mamdani's credibility and expose the fundamental weakness of ideological politics. "You mentioned welfare reform as an example of neoliberal betrayal," Clinton said, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous during presidential debates. "But let me ask you something. Do you know what the welfare rolls look like today compared to when I took office?" Mamdani shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for specific policy questions from someone who had actually implemented the programs he was criticizing. "Welfare rolls fell by 60% during my administration and have remained low ever since," Clinton continued. "Millions of Americans moved from welfare to work, and poverty rates declined across every demographic group. Was it perfect? No. Did it help more people than it hurt? Absolutely. The response revealed everything wrong with progressive politics, a focus on ideological purity over practical results, a preference for moral posturing over measurable outcomes. Then came the moment that would define the entire exchange and generate months of political commentary. "You know what the real difference is between us, Mayor?" Clinton asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had won the hardest political contests in America. "I actually won elections, not just in safe democratic districts, but in competitive states with voters who disagreed with me on plenty of issues." The line, "I actually won elections," landed like a political nuclear weapon. Clinton had just reminded everyone that winning elections, especially difficult elections, required skills that Mamdani had never developed, and understanding that he clearly lacked. "I won Arkansas governor 5 times, including after losing my first re-election campaign," Clinton continued, his biography becoming part of his political weapon. "I won presidential elections twice, carrying states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, states that haven't voted Democratic since. You know why? Because I understood that good intentions without electoral victories are just expensive hobbies." The audience was transfixed. They were witnessing a master politician delivering a clinic on the difference between idealistic rhetoric and practical politics. "You criticize compromise, but compromise is how you get things done in a democracy," Clinton said, his voice rising with passion. "You attack incrementalism, but incrementalism is how you build sustainable change. You prefer purity to progress, but purity without power helps nobody." Each point landed with devastating effectiveness because it came from someone who had actually governed, who had faced the real-world constraints that ideological politicians preferred to ignore. But Clinton still wasn't finished dismantling Mamdani's entire approach to politics. "Let me tell you something about electoral politics that you clearly don't understand," he said, his tone becoming more pointed. "Voters don't care about your theories. They care about results. They don't want revolution, they want their lives to get better. And if you can't deliver that, if you can't win the elections necessary to deliver that, then you're not a progressive. You're just another politician who prefers feeling righteous to being effective." The systematic destruction was complete, but Clinton delivered one final blow that would be quoted in political science textbooks for decades. "I've spent 50 years in politics, Mayor, and I've learned something important. There's no nobility in losing elections with pure principles. The only thing that matters is helping people, and you can't help people from the minority. So before you lecture Democrats about political strategy, ask yourself this question. What have you actually accomplished beyond giving speeches to people who already agree with you? The silence that followed was profound. Clinton had just systematically demolished not just Mamdani's arguments, but his entire political identity. The former president had reminded everyone why he remained the gold standard for democratic political success. He understood that politics was about persuasion, not just proclamation. Mamdani's attempt at a response was politically catastrophic. Clearly rattled by Clinton's systematic dismantling of his worldview, he fell back on progressive talking points about the need for transformational change and the dangers of corporate centrism. President Clinton, with respect, Mamdani began, his voice betraying his discomfort. I think we have different definitions of success. Some of us believe that true progress requires challenging the fundamental structures that perpetuate inequality, not just managing them more efficiently. The response perfectly illustrated Clinton's point about the difference between governing and theorizing. Here was a politician who preferred ideological purity to practical results, moral posturing to measurable outcomes. Clinton's response was swift and devastating. Challenging fundamental structures? He said, his voice dripping with incredulity. Mayor, I appointed the first black Secretary of Commerce, the first woman Attorney General, the first woman Secretary of State. I integrated the military, expanded civil rights protections, and appointed more diverse judges than any president in history. Those weren't theoretical challenges, those were actual changes that improved actual lives. The contrast was brutal. While Mamdani talked about challenging structures, Clinton had actually changed them. The immediate aftermath was explosive. Conservative media celebrated Clinton's takedown as vindication of their argument that democratic success required moderation and pragmatism. But more significantly, mainstream Democrats who had grown tired of progressive lecturing finally had cover from the party's most successful politician. The clips of Clinton's response went viral across social media platforms, with the "I actually won elections" soundbite becoming an instant classic. Political operatives from both parties shared the video as an example of masterful political communication. Most damaging for Mamdani was how Clinton's response highlighted his lack of practical political experience outside safe democratic territory. The former president had exposed him as someone who had never faced real electoral competition, never had to persuade skeptical voters. Progressive activists tried to defend Mamdani by attacking Clinton's record and arguing that electoral success shouldn't be the only measure of political effectiveness. But their responses fell flat because Clinton's achievements were undeniable. He had actually delivered progressive victories while winning elections. The long-term impact on democratic politics was profound. Clinton's systematic dismantling of Mamdani's approach provided a template for other moderate Democrats to push back against progressive demands for ideological purity. For the Democratic Party establishment, Clinton's intervention was a godsend. The party's most successful politician had articulated what many felt but couldn't express: that good intentions without electoral victories were meaningless, that progressive goals required practical politics. 6 months after Little Rock, internal Democratic polling showed the lasting impact of Clinton's critique. Support for pragmatic progressive policies had increased among Democratic voters, while support for revolutionary rhetoric had declined. The 3-minute destruction had reminded the Democratic Party of something it had temporarily forgotten: that politics is about winning elections to help people, not losing elections to maintain principles. Clinton had proven that you could be progressive and practical, idealistic and effective, transformational and electable. As one veteran Democratic strategist put it, Bill Clinton just reminded us why he's the only Democrat to win 2 presidential elections since FDR. He understands something that these ideological purists don't. You can't help people if you can't win elections. The master politician had delivered a master class in political reality, leaving Mamdani to learn the hard way that there's a difference between giving speeches about change and actually delivering it. In 3 minutes, Clinton had reminded everyone why electoral success matters more than ideological purity and why governing is more important than posturing.